So hello everyone, and thank you for joining our today event, the event we have today. So the title of the event that we have now is Yugoslavia 30 years on. The direct occasion for the event is the start of the dissolution of socialist Yugoslavia, which basically started with the decision of Croatia and Slovenia to become independent on the 25th of June 1991. So we mark basically the 30th anniversary of the start of the breakup of Yugoslavia these days. And that's a direct occasion for this event. But the reasons are deeper, I would say. And the reasons lie in the notion, understanding that we have, which is that the Yugoslav experience can serve as an example for the future, at least to some extent. That we can use the Yugoslav legacy, at least to some extent, for something good in the future. There are some good things there that we can still use for the time being and for the future. So usually when people talk about the Yugoslavia experience, they usually take either the stance that it was perfect, they are kind of glorifying the time, glorifying the idea, everything was perfect, or they take the other extreme, which is kind of negating everything, like it was terrible, it ended in the blood shed, so it was a really, really bad experience. So we don't want to go into these extreme cases. We just want to be more rational, let's say, and we want to see, to think about the experience more rationally, and to see if there was something positive which can serve for today and for the future for this region. And so that's why we basically have this distinguished panel today, which consists of Vesna Pusic, who is the former Deputy Prime Minister of Croatia, and also a professor and sociologist, professor at the University in Zagreb. And she was also chairing the Croatia's National Committee for accession, for EU accession negotiations. And then we have Momir Mrak, who is a professor, full-time professor at the University in Ljubljana, professor in economics. And he is also the Jean Monnet Chair at the same university. And he was advisor on several occasions to the Slovenian government. And he was also involved heavily in the accession of Slovenia to EU. And then we have Veton Suroi, who is the former leader of a political party in Kosovo, ORA, and also one of the founders of the Kosovar newspaper, Koha Ditor. And he also participated in the negotiations which are here in Vienna for the independence of Kosovo. And then last but not least, we have Vladimir Gligorov, who is a legend of our institute. And he's a well-known economist, economic researcher and analyst covering the Balkan region, and also he has political experience as well. He is one of the founders of the Democratic Party in Serbia, and he's been involved in many democratic and political movements in the region. And I will be, let's say, the moderator of the event, and I'm really honored to be, let's say, in the presence of these distinguished scholars and intellectuals. So without further ado, I will jump straight to the panel that we envisage today. We want to have this, to make this panel as interesting and as dynamic, let's say, as possible. We don't want to go into long monologues. We want to keep it, let's say, sharp. And that's why the way we envisaged it was to have for the first hour, like discussion between us here. And then after that, we go to questions from the audience. And you can ask your questions in this Q&A button here down. So you press it and you can pose your questions. You can write them, and it's very easy to use and very straightforward. So please use that. If you're not familiar with that, you can also use the chat, but let's try to use the Q&A session first. So yeah, for the first hour, we talk, and then for the next 30 minutes, we go to questions and answers. And for the first hour, we will go with short questions and short responses from the people at the event now, from the speakers. And as a general rule, I would kindly ask you to stick to maybe 3 minutes maximum for your responses to my questions. And we'll go in several rounds. So basically, we'll have the same question for everybody. So I'll start with the first question, which is actually the most difficult question. It's very short, but very difficult question. And that question is, did Yugoslavia have to break up? I'll start with Vesna.
Well, to your short and difficult question, my short and easy answer is no. It didn't have to break up. However, now goes the explanation. Considering how things developed, especially how things developed from, let's say, the mid-70s, and then in particularly in the 80s, everything was leading in a way in that direction. Yugoslavia eliminated its successor political elite in the early 70s. It was eliminated from political life. It emerged in Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, and Macedonia. And it was eliminated by the old guard after some deliberation by Tito himself. And it faced the 80s after Tito's death. It faced without anybody to take over. It actually didn't have a plan for the future. It probably had a very good plan for the, let's say, from mid-50s to mid-70s. But after that, it didn't really know where to go, how to go, what the objectives were. All the main things that Yugoslavia based its identity on were passé, so to speak, were not either interesting or relevant or attractive anymore. And in the 80s, actually, in some ways you could say, or I would say, let's say, that the state slowly really disappeared or slowly started to work itself into irrelevance. And in many ways, the society or societies that lived next to each other took over a number of different roles and functions that otherwise one would somehow expect the state to have. So in a way, a colleague of ours calls this the sort of, wrote the book actually under the title Yugoslavia, the state that withered away. But actually it disappeared in a way sooner than we became aware of that, and certainly sooner than the actual tragedy of dissolution, of the way it was dissolved or pulled apart, happened. But the issues that Yugoslavia was facing stayed on, and those were the curse of small numbers, the lack of statehood tradition, and the lack of democratic tradition. And this was something that Yugoslavia somehow didn't know how to deal with. But in many ways, I would say that the successor states also have the same problem.
Thank you, Vesna. Excellent. Vladimir, how would you respond to this?
Well, you always want to think about whether there was, you don't want to engage into historical counterfactuals. So you really want to think, looking at the problems, whether there were ways that these could be solved with Yugoslavia surviving. And I think the answer is yes. Yugoslavia was, in that sense, capable of solving the problems it was facing. It was at the forefront of socialist countries, or socialist world, if you wish, which was disappearing. And the obvious answer was to go for democratization. The problems that were that accumulated, especially after the crisis in late 60s, early 70s that Vesna also mentioned, there was an obvious need to regain the legitimacy. The obvious way was democratic means, which means elections and all that. And given the international setup with the emerging EU and collapsing Soviet world, I think that would have been an answer that would have actually been good for the country and would have actually been a solution to both international and internal problems to Yugoslavia. It went the other way. I tend to blame the Serbian side the most, but everybody played a role, and in the end, that's what we had. Looking at the costs of the breakup, again, without wanting to get into counterfactuals, but looking at the cost of the breakup, it is counterintuitive to say that you couldn't have found another way which would have at least saved the political setup in whatever incarnation it would have ended up. So yes, I think there was no reason, obvious reason, there was no fundamental flaw that would have doomed the country.
Excellent, thank you. Moimir, your take on this?
Well, it's it's not very easy to talk after Vesna and Vladimir on those things. But yeah, I think I would really pick up from what Vladimir said. In my view, this democratization issue was probably the key thing. We had this, what happened in the 60s, 70s, Vesna mentioned. We had this, I remember in Slovenia, not personally, but these governments, very liberal movements, which were kind of then pressed up. So I know the similar things were in some other parts. Then you had, of course, the death of Tito. And I think we have not mentioned yet, we have to be fair. In the 70s, we were basically living beyond our means in economic terms. In economic terms, then the beginning of the 80s, it was a kind of not coincidence, but more or less at the same time we had the Tito's death, but on the other side, a completely different setup of the international economic environment, with interest rates, going up to 20%. In today's situation, talking about this is very difficult. So the point which I would like to say is that we had a problem on the political side, which were then kind of strengthened with the economic problems. Servicing, we had this continuous then, arrangements with the IMF and so on. But I still think, in the second half of the 80s, with this Markovic program, I think it was still possible if there would be a kind of the arrangements on the one side within Yugoslavia, which was obviously not possible, but also these ideas about the confederation. But if this would not be accompanied with a very quick EU accession path, I don't think that this confederation, which was discussed at that moment, would really solve the problem. I remember in Slovenia, that idea was very strongly put forward. We were, I would say also personally, I was very much at that time supporting of this. But now looking back, I think without a very quick accession to the EU, this would probably not work. So we came to the situation that obviously the things went so far away that it was difficult to continue together.
Thank you, Moimir. Veton, your 2 cents.
Okay. First, I think your question is a bit deterministic. So to respond to it in an easy way is no, Yugoslavia should not have or could not have died. It could have existed further. But there's no deterministic path that would establish one or the other. So countries actually are born and die based on their internal narratives and their exterior context. And Yugoslavia at that point lost its transformational narratives. The socialist Tito's Yugoslavia was a transformational story for all of its peoples and for the country. And at one point, it stopped being transformational. It established a transformational path within the republics and the autonomous provinces. And that's where we are stuck now for about 30 years, trying to transform our own societies. The second factual point that I want to contest is that the dissolution of Yugoslavia did not actually start, even legally speaking, with Slovenia and Croatia. It started with Serbia, because the Serbian constitution, Milosevic's constitution, established that the prevalence of the Serbian constitution was prevalent, and that in any conflict between the Serbian constitution and the federal constitution, the Serbian constitution should be respected. And that basically meant the end of the federation in legal terms. In political terms, the federation was contested, and the idea of the federation was contested in 81 and 82 with the Kosovar demonstrations that were demanding the republic and the immediate violent response to it. Once that identity Pandora's box became opened, then it was up for grabs of defining what kind of country Yugoslavia would be, what kind of federation it would be, what kind of identities would the republics have. And the basic question is Yugoslavia possible at all as a country of equals? And this is something that in the end prevailed.
Thank you. Excellent answers. I really like the start of the discussion. Okay, now let's go to the second topic that I want to ask. So it's basically, you kind of mentioned this in your talk, several of you. So 30 years after the, let's say, start of the breakup of Yugoslavia, we still see that people in this region, in the Yugosphere, majority of people in the Yugosphere, still have some positive opinion or feelings towards that period. And often in surveys, they say that life was better then, or the breakup brought more harm than good, and things like that. So why is this? Why do we see this? Is it because Yugoslavia was good, or is it because what we had afterwards was much worse? So let's start with Vladimir now.
Well, if you look at the opinion polls throughout the 90s and then afterwards and so on, you do see a pattern being that there is a positive appreciation in Croatia. Croatia has always been not very much positively oriented toward Yugoslavia after the dissolution. And you also get the same response in Kosovo. So these are two places where consistently, obviously for reasons of what went on in terms of violence and military intervention and wars and so on, it consistently, there is a negative or a positive opinion of independence, a negative opinion on the Yugoslav legacy. In other countries, it depends. I think if you look at Slovenia, Mojmir will correct me, but Slovenian independence was also not an easy one economically. The major, I defer to Mojmir on that, but this is my opinion. The major thing was that Slovenia started experiencing relatively high unemployment, which stayed as a problem for a very long time, which wasn't really the problem in Yugoslavia. So if you think about how happy you are with Slovenia, you may have an idea that maybe there was something good in Yugoslavia, which you see in the opinion polls. The other countries obviously were victims of the dissolution of Yugoslavia, Macedonia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, even Montenegro, until it became independent from Serbia. So you can see that for these places, Yugoslavia was a security arrangement which collapsed. You have to always have in mind that a state is primarily, in the first place, a security arrangement. And if it doesn't satisfy that kind of, then obviously it's not a good arrangement. And you can look at security situation in Bosnia, in Macedonia, and the risks that you face there, and you see that why that is the case. Serbia is a special case, I think. There you are hard pressed now to find positive opinion on Yugoslavia in the press. Opinion polls may come out this way or that way, but in the public that you can read, Yugoslavia is really the cause of all the Serbian problems, and the worst decision that Serbian politicians made was to actually not go for Greater Serbia after the First World War, but for Yugoslavia. That's sort of the main opinion. On the welfare side, it could be different, given that in economic terms, Serbia has fared terribly in the last 30 years. So you could see that being played there.
Thanks. Mojmir, would you like to respond?
Well, I would be glad to continue basically on what Vladimir said. Yes, you know, in Slovenia, at certain point, at that time, this elite came to the conclusion that Yugoslavia will, for one or another reason, not work anymore. So I think this preparation for the independence were pretty serious ones. And as Vladimir said, the independence had a very strong negative implication on economic terms. But we have to be clear here, that was basically the 91. That was not then surprisingly that we were basically had to introduce our currency practically from one day to another. I think we had a unique situation that we are basically living for 6 months in Slovenia with the bonds of the Ministry of Finance, not with the currency. And there was not a problem operating this. I'm just trying to give you a sense that the people at that time, when this decision was taken to go this way, was taken relatively serious and relatively strong commitment of the population in large. One thing which was a legacy, if you want, of the former Yugoslavia was that basically we lost the Yugoslav market, but the Slovenian companies were relatively able to divert then to the Western Europe. That's a big difference of this self-management economic system than from the, you know, the other Central or Eastern European countries, because all these directors, they did have contacts in Italy, Austria. So I think, you know, what Vladimir said, you know, in 93, we were already on the positive growth. And so, yeah, there was a big shock, but it was relatively quick to be remedied. Yes, now looking back 30 years, I would say, you know, Branimir, I was looking at your research here, talking about this, you know, going up for the 1% of the population and the 40%. Look, I think if you would look any of the transition countries, you would get more or less a similar pattern. So I would not say that this is something specific in Yugoslavia. Look, we decided to go from a socialist country to a capitalist country with a market economy, with increasing differences among the population. And I would still say, you know, even 30 years on, we are still relatively egalitarian states. Still, at least when I'm talking for Slovenia. Is this good or bad? So we can talk, but definitely we cannot attribute it to the default of Yugoslavia, because that was more the issue of the transition than the issue of the Yugoslav felt apart. What I would say one thing, I would also, it would be interesting to see other views. I think the whole big issue was how then this succession of the former Yugoslavia was done. Look, Czechoslovakia, you know, these guys have very easily agreed everything on 2-1. Czech 2, Slovak 1. it was the debt, it was the assets, everything.
We lost Moimir.
I think he's back or not. Okay, never mind. So his time was anyway up. Okay, Veton, do you want to continue?
Sure. We are the outliers there in Kosovo on Yugoslavia and a bit of nostalgia, and there's not much nostalgia here in Kosovo traditionally. And well, several reasons, but one of the main reasons is that there was a wave of repression in Kosovo throughout the 80s. That was a blanket repression, so to speak. From 82 till 87, 700,000 people were out of a population of 2 million were dealt by the police in unofficial capacity. This was a report that was given at the time. And the basic question was, Kosovo in any case found it difficult to find its own place in Yugoslavia. The name is adverse itself to the notion of the Albanians. It is the country of the Southern Slavs. But this evolution reached the point in which the highest stage was the autonomy of 1974. And this was taken away by Milosevic in a Yugoslavia that respected at the end that decision. So because of this long adversarial relationship, there has not, even the positive aspects of Yugoslavia, such as the tremendous transformation of the Albanian people in Kosovo from totally illiterate to having a university in 20-something years, is somehow given a different light, not a necessary light, or the transformation in health, or the transformation in life expectancy, or the economic growth in a very, very small period of time. That was a product of that country, basically. This is given a backstage compared to repression. So repression and identity and political clashes are still ongoing because this is still an ongoing, unfinished conflict.
Thanks, Veton. Moimir, if you don't mind, I will go to Vesna now, and later on you can continue.
Sorry for this interruption. I don't know what.
It happens. It happens. Okay. So Vesna, please.
Thank you. I looked at the opinion poll data, how the samples or the population in different former republics, now countries or states, evaluated Yugoslav times versus independence. And I would say, first of all, I think you have to look at every country separately because different things were important in forming public opinion. But primarily, I would say two things were important. One was public discourse or propaganda, if you want. And the other were facts on the ground. And let me start with Slovenia. Slovenia supposedly valued Yugoslavia over independent Slovenia. But actually, the research was in 2019. The numbers are 45% in favor of Yugoslavia, 41% in favor of independent Slovenia. So very close. And I would almost be prepared to bet after Janša's propaganda last year or two, you would probably find Slovenia even closer to Croatia's result, valuing independent Slovenia more than former Yugoslavia. Kosovo is clear. Kosovo went more or less genocide in the
okay, Vesna is also okay. Moimir, do you want maybe to finish your thought from before? Until
I'm not sure where I was kicked out. I mean, when I was No, the point is, which I wanted to say was at that time that basically two things. One, that these things what are going on in terms of the concentration of the wealth in some part of the countries is not really the issue of dissolution of Yugoslavia, but it's basically the issue of a transition process. I would say if you would look the Czech Republic, Slovak Republic, I'm pretty sure you will find a similar situation. So that was what probably I was lost. So please just go ahead.
Okay. Vesna, please. So I'm sorry that technical issues, but if one of us just goes away, I think we should continue with the others.
Of course.
So yeah.
Absolutely.
Please continue, Vesna.
Absolutely. Should I continue?
Yes, please.
Okay. Kosovo, I would say, hello? Yeah?
Yes.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Kosovo, I think, was basically the result of more or less genocide in the 90s and the repression in the, and it's clear that they were overjoyed regardless of the nature of the state that they got the independence. I would say that also, especially in Croatia,
I think we have problems again with Vesna. So Vesna, can you maybe turn off your camera? Maybe it will improve the connection of it.
let me see.
Let's try once again.
Okay. So I would say that in Croatia, certainly to some extent, but I would say also in some other places, there were people also felt somehow betrayed by Yugoslavia, especially because of the way it dissolved or was pulled apart. One of the key integrating factors of Yugoslavia after Tito's death was the Yugoslav army. That Yugoslav army was transformed under Milosevic into basically a Milosevic's army. But it still had the name of an insignia of the Yugoslav army. And that Yugoslav army that was supposed to be one of the integrators of the country was all of a sudden committing atrocities all over Croatia and all over Bosnia and Herzegovina. So I would say that also created a sense of betrayal. And then there is also, I would say, an interesting sort of comparison between Croatia and Serbia. In Serbia, seeing, based on your data that you presented, like 80-something% of people saw Yugoslavia as a positive thing. And in Croatia, majority, 55, I think, percent saw independence as a positive, and only 23 saw Yugoslavia as a positive thing. This is, I think, sort of something I would call a big, long historical misunderstanding about what Yugoslavia was all about between Croatia and Serbia. And the best description I ever found of that is in a book called The Flags, or Zastave, by a Croatian writer, Miroslav Krleža, where he describes, after the First World War, he describes a train trip that two men take together. One is a Serbian army officer, and the other is a Croatian, let's say, bureaucrat, state bureaucrat. And in their discussion, they're taking the train between Zagreb and Belgrade. And in their discussion, you see that they see, after the First World War, Yugoslavia completely differently. The Croatian bureaucrat sees it as the South Slavs now finally uniting and being able to stand up to Germanization, Hungarization, Italianization, whatever dangers you had. And the Serbian military officer seeing Serbia as having won the war. And all these other guys that were all over the place and having actually gain territory and gain control over a much bigger space. So there was, I would say, that misunderstanding of what the country was all about between Serbian and Croatian political elites since I would say since the 1918, and in a way it stayed on, and it's visible in your research to a large extent, or in your opinion polls. There is also the fact of the extremely brutal experience of the wars in Bosnia, parts of Croatia, and Kosovo. To some extent influenced also the opinion of the people.
Thank you. Now I want to go to the next topic, which is kind of related to this one, but it's more specific. And that is, so if we, let's say, agree maybe that there's also something good in Yugoslavia, can you concretely name or mention some things which you think were good then, and which can be maybe example for these countries that we have today or for the future? Something that was, let's say, good then, that we don't have it now, but we can maybe borrow it from that time. So I would like to start now with Mojmir, if you don't mind.
Well, I mean, we are 30 years from that time, and I think the world has changed dramatically. So I think to make a very direct comparison sometimes is simply not really realistic. And another comment on the previous question, how you would ask somebody who is 20, 30 years old to compare what was going on in Yugoslavia. So it's, they will make their decision based off what the older one tells them or what is the perception. So I would think that this comparison don't have really too much of a relevance anymore. But let me come back to this. Yugoslavia was a very specific socialist economy, country, if you want. On the political side, it was a non-aligned country, which was a very specific in that environment, but that was possible in the environment that you had the West and East. What you would talk today, nobody knows anymore anything about the non-aligned movement. So at that time, I think that was a policy which was on that area very, how would I say, way to put the country forward. And I think at that point, it was also a very successful one. Second thing, on the economic side, Yugoslav economy was a socialist economy, but it was still very different from any of the other countries. I will just give you one example because I think it's very important. If many of you will know, Yugoslavia was a member of the World Bank and all of those institutions, and Yugoslav companies were able to get funding from the IFC. I don't know how many of whether you know precisely what does it mean, but it means IFC was established to finance exclusively private sector. So it means that the Yugoslav companies were considered by this global financial institution, not by the state ownership, but as something very different from that. Why this is important? This is very important because when we started to talk about the privatization, it was a completely different story to talk about the privatization in Yugoslavia than in privatization in any of the other countries. Because in Yugoslavia, the workers consider that companies as, their companies. And when you privatize, you did take this from them. While in the case of the state ownership, that was not theirs. So I'm just trying to give you a sense that the privatization in the case of Yugoslavia was, at least in my view, more difficult than in any other socialist countries. We made a lot of a mess out of this in Slovenia because we went with this type of a privatization, with the vouchers and so on, and then it ended up in a mess. I'm just trying to give you a sense that Yugoslavia had a number of things which were very specific. They were very good foundation from something else. And, if the Yugoslavia would be kind of governed well and with a strong international support it did have at that time, I think it could very easily end up very quickly also in the EU. And if this would be the case, I'm not sure that that would be sufficient to prevent the collapse of Yugoslavia, but that would definitely be a very important element at that time.
Thank you, Mojmir. Veton, your view on this?
Well, always compare it with the last 20 years have been the only years in which the majority of people in Kosovo have not been persecuted by the government, by the police. You know, it's the first time that you actually look at a policeman and not fear from him. And this is a dramatic change. That's on the one side. On the other side, there are two things that are probably missing, and missing at the 21st century, although we had them in the 20th century. One is Bismarck and the social state. And we don't have that in Kosovo today. We have gone back from the notion of social state into a grab it for all, in which you have a deterioration of both education and health capacity. So if we had a linear growth, so to speak, if the Republic of Kosovo had somehow inherited and without violence, without war, the social state of the socialist autonomous province of Kosovo, and the education system, and without these, of course, political conflicts, then we would have had a transition that would get us closer to the other Bismarckian states, if you will, in Europe. And the second element that is missing is something that probably the people from the other republics don't feel, but it is the intense sense of parochialism, of being closed and isolated. You know, we continuously have to remind the younger generations that we were able to go to Croatia and Slovenia. That was very normal for us to actually go to Croatia and Slovenia, and that we felt maybe not entirely at home, but felt certainly in with cousins, if you will, for lacking a better notion. And this is something that is entirely missing, especially for Kosovo, totally isolated, without visa, Schengen, a free visa regime. An average Kosovar kid in his 20s has enormous difficulty understanding how we were able to travel with a socialist Yugoslavia passport throughout Europe. And the only exceptions at the time were Spain, the US, South Africa, and Albania, and Russia, I think. These were the 5 countries where we needed both internal and external visas. In Albania, we needed also an external visa at the time. But this sense of being closed in a parochial, it does not mean only in terms of freedom of movement. It means also in terms of freedom of thinking. Parochialism is killing a lot of the intellectual debate and a lot of public discourse in Serbia, from what I can see, in Bosnia, in Kosovo. And not only are we closed in a geographic notion, we are closed to an unfinished conflict. And this is making us more and more parochial than ever.
Thank you, Veton. Vesna, how would you respond?
I would divide the life and times of Yugoslavia after the Second World War into 3 phases. One from 45 to 55, roughly, which is Stalinism and Stalinism after Stalinism, after breakup with Stalin. It's sort of the methods were similar. Then from 55 to 75 or 1980, and then 80 to 1990. And certainly the best period from which I think we could learn or where we felt identified, where you could use something from the country is this period 56, let's say, to 1975 or 1980. What were the good things? The good things were the positive trends, both economically and politically. We were, even in the best of times, we were poor. My family was poorer than it is today, but every year was a little better. And in a way, we were poor together and we were getting better together, which was also very, very important for this sense of optimism. And both in terms of living standards and in terms of political freedoms. And they were gradually sort of letting go. There was also a certain pride in being from Yugoslavia. There was, through self-management, which was far from democracy, but it was certainly more than anything they had in other socialist countries. The fact that we could travel freely, what Veton was mentioning, the non-alignment, I think also very, very important. Those were the things that were done at the right time, not even at the right time, maybe even a little bit before the right time. So Yugoslavia developed a sense of exceptionalism. And this exceptionalism is always somehow associated in this period, not the entire time, but in this period. And this exceptionalism is always associated with the United States. The United States are, yeah. And you could see in the short or long 4 Trump years, when he abdicated from this American exceptionalism and American role in the world, how traumatic that was for an old established democracy like the United States with stable old institutions. And you can imagine how traumatic that was for the successor states of former Yugoslavia. When that exceptionalism disappeared, this, I would say, the definition of political success, which is that your status and your influence is greater than your size and your economic strength. And that Yugoslavia was. It was really more important and played a more important role than its size and economic strength would have justified. And this has completely disappeared. But what we can learn from this is that actually this sense of not fake pride, not the pride that's sort of some kind of peer pressure or government pressure, you have to be proud to be Croat, or you have to be proud to be Serb, but or Slovenian or whatever, but actually identifying with a progress that the country is making and the achievements is something that I think we should and could have learned from this period in Yugoslavia, but it somehow didn't catch, I would say, unfortunately, and it somehow is not happening in any of the successor states.
Thanks. Vladimir, your take on this?
Well, I think it's difficult to argue positively for the political system in Yugoslavia. It could have been transformed into a democratic system, but as it was, it was pretty dysfunctional and repressive very often, not only in Kosovo, but in all the places. I remember after 68, 71, and so on, in other countries, even in Serbia, even in my personal experience. So you also don't think you can argue seriously about economic opportunities being exploited as much as you could, given the position in which the country was and so on. There were huge mistakes in the 70s and a whole lost decade in the 80s. Basically no growth for about 10 years or so. So what you can say is, I think, very positive was in a way, the fact that there was a much larger intellectual and cultural market, so to speak, and it was an open country. So the cooperation, let's say, in cultural stuff, in intellectual issues, in scientific discourse, the openness of the country to look both east and west, south and north, and really be, if you lived in Belgrade, you could essentially follow in some rather fundamental sense what was going on in the world and be part of it. You could travel to New York if you wanted to go, if you could go to London without a visa if you wanted to go, you could organize whatever you wanted to organize, if not in Yugoslavia, outside. So the cultural life is, and also I think the fundamental fact is that the large part of the country spoke the same language. And that in itself, as a market, will produce value, which in fact was the case. Now, if you look now, I think you could see that, as Veton said, and I think there is other places you can mention, Macedonia, certainly, Montenegro, Bosnia and Herzegovina, but I think in Croatia and Slovenia too, there is much more a parochial cultural and intellectual life, and completely unnecessary barriers to cooperation or to communication within people who, after all, share a large part, not just of linguistic heritage, but of intellectual heritage, cultural heritage, literature, and so on. So it seems to me that that is the major advantage of what we had in Yugoslavia. The country was well positioned to be transformed in something that was sustainable and was and could have been a significant contributor to the EU. I agree with Moimir that EU membership, this outside anchor, would have been fundamental and crucial. And in fact, it would be inconceivable that any other country in the socialist world would have become member of the EU prior to Yugoslavia, had Yugoslavia continued to exist, given the whole history of Yugoslavia from 1948 and what huge contribution the anti-Stalin thing had to Europe and basically to the Western world. So if you think of it that way, that's what was but the system, economic and political, was basically such that it was putting brakes. That would be one thing. But then, of course, there is all this nationalist stuff, which I personally have difficulties understanding, but other people obviously cherish.
Thanks, Vladimir. So now let's jump into the future, and this is our last group of questions, or question, not a group, let's say. So basically, I want to ask you now about EU. I know it's a difficult one, so let's start in the same way. Let's finish in the same way as we started. So I guess everybody will agree that the future of these countries, the future of the region, is in the EU, but EU doesn't seem to like us. We saw it yesterday too. And do you think that there's something we can do beyond EU? Is there something that we as a region can do for ourselves, let's say, to improve our lives on our own? Or do we have to wait to become part of the EU and then to start changing things? Let's start with Veton now.
Well, I don't think we will be seeing anything dramatic concerning integration of the region in the next 10 years or so. And lacking that, I don't see any outside magnetic force, if you will, that will attract changes in our societies. That might move us into understanding into the conceptual question is whether we can arrange for a region of freedoms an area for European freedoms in the Western Balkan countries. Is that possible at all? Conceptually, it is. And if you can, I mean, the basic logic is if you want to be part of the European Union and engage in an area for freedoms, why can you not be doing that in your own neighborhood? And this is a question that is continuously being presented from people, from well-wishing people in the European Union. And the quick answer is it's not for lack of will. It's not that people have closed minds and will say, no, we don't want to live in areas of freedoms. It's because conflicts have not finished. This is the Western Balkan countries live in an area of unfinished conflicts. And unfinished conflicts are in the triangle between Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Kosovo. Bosnia-Herzegovina has an unfinished conflict because it lives under a peace agreement, basically, not a constitutional arrangement that has legitimacy with its own population. Kosovo and Serbia live in an unfinished conflict because Serbia still claims that Kosovo is part of it. Kosovo claims it is independent. And unless there is an arrangement that will find a way out for these countries to live in cohabitation, there is no way into, it's a catch-22 situation. You cannot get into a regional arrangement unless you finish the conflict, but the other way around. You cannot finish these conflicts unless you see a wider picture of regional arrangements. And this is where we are at this stage. Differing from 10 years ago or 15 years ago, or from the Thessaloniki summit when it was said that, you know, the Thessaloniki summit happened 2003, so it's 18 years from now. It said that the region has a European perspective. Well, this has been continuously said, and the region will continue to have an EU perspective for the next 100 years at this pace. It's not that anything substantial will have changed. So the main issue is today, can we change the pattern from conflict to, or frozen conflict to, or unfinished conflict to resolution of conflict? Or is there a need for this region to deteriorate? And the narratives are deteriorating in the region. There's, if you read the Serbian press, and I suppose if the Serbs might read statements here in Kosovo or in Bosnia, you will see a lot more of hatred, or the similar level of hatred that you have seen in the 80s and the 90s. And the test is Srebrenica. Can you accept that there has been genocide in Srebrenica? If you cannot accept as a society that there's been a genocide in Srebrenica and that there's been actually a court decision on it 2 times, then how can you deal with reality today if you cannot deal with that kind of tremendous past?
Thanks, Veton. Vesna, your comment?
EU is very useful, but EU has changed dramatically in, even since 2013 when Croatia entered, and certainly since 2004 when there was the big bang of first East European countries joining the European Union. But also the leaderships in our countries. And I would say both the 2 that are members of the European Union and the 6 that are not members of the European Union, the leaderships have also changed. And their attitudes and policies have changed. And of course, I would say that probably in some countries, still the majority of public opinion supports countries' membership in the European Union. But people are of course, more skeptical because the transformational power that membership in the European Union had 10 years ago has changed or disappeared to a large extent, or certainly is much weaker. However, from our own experience and my personal experience with this whole business of accession to the European Union, I would say that the most useful thing about European Union is the accession process, or the acquis communautaire, the long, boring document that you have to comply with. This has a lot of positive things in it. It makes politics less heroic. And our problem in the Balkans is that we always go for the heroics, for sort of very dramatic things, instead of functioning institutions, accountability, etc. The lack of interest, or I would say actually the lack of really leadership in the EU that resulted in this stalemate in with the accession process in the Western Balkans, I think, regardless of what is being said, is welcomed by a big section of the political elites in the Western Balkan countries. Because however weak the transformational power might be at the moment, it still changes things, and you cannot do absolutely whatever, let's say, without people reacting, without getting some feedback, as is the case in all of the countries right now. The two things that are the most useful, in my experience, from this acquis communautaire, or this joint league body of laws of the European Union, are the judiciary and the fight against corruption. These are also our weakest, and for all of us, our weakest points or weakest links in our states. And the question is, this is on the books, it's usable and it's useful. And you can use it and transform your own, we all can use it and transform our own judiciary into something that works and is accountable, and establish institutions that were tried and that work, that fight corruption. The question is there sufficient political will? Is there sufficient political will in these countries to do that, regardless of the European Union? But of course, if you have public pressure, if you have public opinions pressure on the political elites to join the European Union, then it's easier to also implement some of these things, as such as the reform of the judiciary and establishing institutions to fight corruption. This could be rolled back, and Croatia is a good example how this could be rolled back, but not all the way. And this is, I think, why these institutions are so important, because we probably had it best in late 2012, early 2013 in Croatia. We joined on July 1st, 2013. And we are worse off than we were then in terms of the functioning judiciary and the fight against corruption. But people know what it is. People are aware that there has been a rolling back of some of these institutions and some of these achievements. And that in itself, I think, is useful, and something that can be then used in the future by maybe a new generation that's entering politics in Croatia, for instance, at the moment. And this is something, if you just take these two things and apply it to the entire region and say, okay, here is the European Union. What we are doing, we are working on these two things and harmonizing these two things. And actually we had already, regardless of EU membership, we had cross-border cooperation on this issue of fighting crime, fighting corruption. So there is some basis for that. If we could establish these two things and work on it together, I think we could move things even as far as membership of the EU is concerned for the Western Balkan Six. And certainly for our own benefit as citizens of these countries.
Thank you, Vesna. Vladimir, your 2 cents?
Well, I think the situation is a mess. If you look at Bosnia, if you look at Serbia, if you look at Kosovo, I think this is a collection of problems that have been there for a very long time, and there is no solution at the horizon. And now you have the Montenegrin issue. So I personally think that EU is far away from this core problematic countries or whatever in so-called Western Balkans. So I think also that EU has made a mistake that it hasn't really rewarded countries that have tried. I'm thinking of Macedonia and Montenegro that have tried as best they can, and certainly they could have done better. But I don't think EU has been helpful in these two places. I guess the idea is that they need to solve the Serbia problem, and then everything falls into place. But I think that's a miscalculation, because as you can see, that problem is far from being solved. So I am pretty pessimistic when it comes to possible solutions that will be originating from the EU or induced or supported by the EU. I think that you need to have some political developments, let's say in Bosnia and Herzegovina, that is positive. I don't see how this can happen, but I just read that the mayors of Banja Luka and Sarajevo have met. So I think some kind of a development like that would help. I think it would be helpful if EU were to support Montenegro very strongly. I don't see how this problem of Macedonia is going to be solved. And then you have this Kosovo-Serbia issue, which is going to drag on. And Serbia as such, at the moment, given the political system, is not really aiming to become a member of the EU. You cannot become a member of the EU and have a openly autocratic system. It just doesn't. I mean, you can try to develop autocracy once you are in the EU, which is what Vesna mentioned. You tend to deteriorate once you get there, but to get in with an autocrat is pretty difficult, I would say. So these are developments as they are. There is, in my opinion, there is very little that in this core issue can be done or that can be pushed forward in the near future. So that's how I see it.
Thanks, Vladimir. And let's conclude with Mojmir.
Well, I was part of the Slovenian team negotiating accession. Why I'm saying this? Because at that time, the whole process was really much more technical, if you want, than it was later on. Already Croatia, but now entirely difficult. I'm not saying that it was not a political one, but there was basically, you had a very strong position at that time of the Commission. And once you made an agreement with the Commission, it was basically the Commission was able to sell this to the member states. Today, this is not the case by any way. So it's a completely different process. Another thing, when we talk about the political criteria, at that time, they were of course there. You know, the Kopenhagen criteria are precisely the same, but they are today, let's say, not just interpreted, but discussed completely different. One big difference is at that time, in our accession, it was more or less adjusting to the acquis communautaire. But, you know, adjusting was more or less meaning that your legislation was in line, not the implementation. But of course, the lessons with some of the countries is have put much stronger, how would I say, pressure on the implementation side. So that's, I think, it's a general issue. We see this through the changes of the strategy of the EU. In this enlargement strategy, I don't know if you are a little bit familiar with this new methodology about the clusters, about the fundamental clusters. You know, I think half of the EU member states can go into discussion on this and we would have problems meeting them. Very important issue, what I think Vesna and Vladimir basically said is, you know, it's a different situation once you are in the accession negotiations and then when you are in. Once you are in does not really mean that you are, you know, abiding to all those rules which are there, including my country over the recent periods. But to be very frank here, I am very happy that we are in the EU, and I will tell you why. Not because of the EU funds. That's, of course, very important. But one important thing, and I remember I said this in 2005, 1 year after the accession, and I will say the same words. I know that some people will not like here in Slovenia. It still makes a little bit more difficult to the politicians for doing whatever they want. I'm not saying that this prevents them to doing things, but you know they still have to explain a little bit. Thank God to be very you know, clear here. So in terms of the Western Balkans, I'm afraid to share Vladimir's view. I am also not very optimistic because of the EU as such. You know, we are not able to agree on anything. You know, if you look when the EU takes decision at the moment when the water comes to here, you know, in very difficult circumstances. Right? If you look at the economic issues, the financial crisis, now the Eurozone is completely different than it was in 10 years ago, but not because if it was a big will to change this, like it was a kind of a pressure, because if we are not doing this, it will go to the hell. So unfortunately, I don't see this pressure for the membership in the Western Balkans, even though I would like to see it in that way, particularly in this, what is going on in the region with the other big forces. I'm not sure that we will really see a very quick accession to the EU. And of course, if this doesn't go on, we will have even more deterioration on the sides of the countries. And I can see, at least in some of the Western Balkan countries, it is very clear that the leadership is not very keen to become the EU member, because, you know, as I said, because once you are an EU member, you still have to, you know, to explain something, not just to your population, but also to somebody else. And this is not very pleasant sometimes.
Thank you, Mojmir. So we are 15 minutes above our planned time, but that means that we had a nice discussion. And I'm left with more questions that I had at the beginning of the event, which I also take as a good sign. Now let's move to the questions from the audience. In the Q&A session, we have so far, I don't know, 10 or something like that questions. So I'll read them, and they are not directed to any person concretely. So whoever of you feels like answering some of those questions, please raise your hand or somehow let me know, and then you can start. So the first question. If the economic situation in Yugoslavia would have been better, more stable and more prosperous, would the breakup still occur? were the political issues more important than the economic ones? So I think it's a very good question. Who wants to take it?
Well, maybe I can take it. Vlado, I think
go ahead.
We can, I think, combine. I think we were basically working on one of the books. Vladimir, you'll remember, for the World Bank, from Slovenia, from Yugoslavia to the EU, and there was, of course, this discussion. The first chapter was, the collapse of the Yugoslavia. I would, my view is here that, of course, yes, economic reasons were there. The economic situation in the 80s was getting worse. We were constantly in the standby arrangement with the IMF. We were basically in the bankruptcies from 83 on. So yes, economic situation was not excellent. But I would still say that even with the better economic situation, without political changes, this will not be prevented. That's my view. Maybe it would be postponed a little bit, but even I'm not sure, and I would like to see what Vladimir thinks on this. Even with the issue of a confederation, I am not sure that this would work on a longer run, because I think on the political side there were so many differences, so many different views, particularly then these nationalisms which were starting at one point, but then they were aggravating. So I would definitely not say that the economic part was the key issue for the dissolution.
Vladimir?
Well, the economic issue was problem because it went into conflict with the system. It's not a question of the difficulty that the crisis presented. The crisis was an exchange rate crisis, which is not an unusual and unknown phenomenon. But the problem was that in order to solve it, you needed to have a different financial arrangement with the world, which also perhaps meant that you had to have a capital market, which meant that you had to get rid of the social ownership. And if you were to get rid of the social ownership, then the question would be, why would you have the Communist Party dictatorship? And because of that, you couldn't actually deal with this systemic economic problem. Politically, the problem was difficult from the very beginning, as Vesna at one point said, from 1918, because of different ideas as to what this country should look like. The confederation, federation, whatever you call it, is just a name. What would be the content of that? And I think within the context of the connections with the EU and possibly accession to the EU, you could find solutions to the problems that were actually there in concrete terms, which is what is the political position or autonomy of a level of autonomy in Kosovo, what is the relationship between republics in, let's say, the fiscal issue used to be a very serious question, who pays what and who contributes to what and so on. All of these issues, I think, you could have solved if you did not have, this is where the EU angle comes in, if you didn't have different ideas or strategies of your political future. Now, of course, if you have different ideas as to what is your political future, you want to be part of the East, not West, or you want to do this or that, then of course the country cannot stay together because you want to do different things. But within the context of what was supposed to be the European integration at that time, I think the political issue, if democratically addressed, could have been solved. But again, you would have to get rid of the monopoly of power, and that was a problem. And how do you displace somebody who runs the country and doesn't really care for democratic ways? And that was the problem. So both issues were important. Systemically, there was a problem in economics to deal with the crisis. Systemically, there was a problem in the political system to dealing with the union. And being unable to solve either, you fell apart.
Branimir, if I may add.
Yes, but let's try to be as quick as possible because we have 12 questions more.
Just to follow up. The economic issue and economic transformation of the country is part of a rational debate. However, after 81 and 82, any rational debate was hijacked by issues of identity on the Kosovo-Serbia relationship. And from that point on, we've had two basic questions. One, can the people in Yugoslavia be equal? Can there be a federation or confederation based on equality? And the answer was no. And the answer was immediately no, because force was used against Kosovo Albanians, repression. And once it was used, it became legitimized as an instrument of solving political problems. So it was no surprise, actually, that in 89 you had a state of emergency. Kosovo, it was no surprise that in 1990 you had tanks rolling on the streets of Belgrade, 91. So that's one issue. The second issue, which is still going on, the second question, which is still going on, is there a Yugoslavia? Was there a Yugoslavia? Was there a possibility to have a Yugoslavia without Serbian supremacism? Because once you have a negative answer to the question of can you be equal, then the next question that emerges is, can you have a supremacist-based organizational structure? And this is where we are at. This is a conceptual question that is not being answered yet, because Serbia is still being run by the attitude that Serbs cannot be a minority anywhere. Serbs need to be in one state. And you have the problem in Montenegro today, you have a problem in Bosnia and Herzegovina, you have Kosovo. You've had that kind of political movement that not only preceded Milosevic, but now succeeded Milosevic. And you have the platform of Serbian supremacism as a platform that not only disintegrated Yugoslavia as such, or helped disintegrate, but cannot help create conditions for a viable transformation of the region into the European Union.
Thanks, Veton. Vesna, do you want also to comment on this, or you'll keep for next one? We can't hear, you're muted. You're still muted.
Yeah. I will wait for the next questions, because if we all answer every question, you won't go through more than one.
Okay, good. So I'll be selective now. We can't take all the questions. Okay, so I'll go with this one. I think it's interesting. At least I'll read it, and if you feel like answering, let me know. How it happened that many of the institutions and solutions that we had in Yugoslavia and we thought were unsuccessful found their way in the democratic societies in Europe, and now they are trying to sell them to us. Is it that we didn't recognize them, or it wasn't time for their implementation? Someone wants to comment on this?
I can comment, since I didn't say anything the last time, but I don't have much to comment, because I don't know which are these institutions that we had in Yugoslavia that they're trying to sell to us now, except maybe for different forms of labor participation in decision making. But self-management was different than different forms of labor participation in Western Europe. And my first job was actually being part of a team a million years ago, and we published two books. One was called Industrial Democracy in Europe, and the other was called European Industrial Relations, comparing different forms of labor participation. The problem with self-management, which was a great idea, it was a combination of different things, not to go into that now, but the problem with self-management was that actually it was supposed to be some kind of substitute for political democracy. And this didn't work. This cannot work. Industrial democracy is an important thing. And it exists in practically every country in Europe, except for ours, where it doesn't exist anymore. But self-management wasn't exactly that. It had this problem of having to be all things to all people, or trying to be all things to all people. And therefore, it had its problems. But other than that, I cannot think of many things that Yugoslavia had that now Western European countries are trying to sell back to us.
Someone else, or should we go to the next one?
I think next one.
Next one, okay. Would you agree that the Kosovo issue broke Yugoslavia's back, that it was the single most important reason, for example, the Slovenian League of Communists to walk out and break up? I guess Svetlana would agree.
Can I just say two sentences?
Yeah, sure.
Absolutely.
No.
You don't think so, okay?
No, I don't think so. It was a very, very important thing, but the key thing was Slobodan Milosevic. The key thing in breakup of Yugoslavia was that there was this very skillful politician who realized that you had this medium-sized country in Europe by European standards of over 20 million people, who for 6 years had nobody in power. And he figured that out in 1986, or showed that he figured that out in 1986, and started his march to power through, and discovered nationalism along the way as a sort of effective and fast way of mass mobilization. And if you remember the threat of the train that was going to go to Ljubljana, of the boycott of Slovenian goods, of, I was sitting in front of the television watching the tanks of the Yugoslav army going down the highway of brotherhood and unity towards Zagreb. I get goosebumps as I talk about it right now. So, Kosovo, and for instance, cheating the miners who were below ground in the Trepča mines was also something that was in this category of using aggression, enormous injustice, and simply attacking the country. And I think that was the key thing. There were obviously also the structural weaknesses, which we all talked about during our discussion. But if you want a sort of coup de grace, a final stroke that broke the camel's back, it was Sloba.
Hey, someone else, quick comment?
Yeah.
I would just really a quick comment. I think, to make this kind of argumentation based on one separate situation is simply not realistic. So it was really, it's like a water. It comes to the top, then at a certain point, the drop goes out. So no, there was many other things which, so I very much agree with Vesna. That would happen.
Well, if I may, Branimir, yes, I think it was a tipping point, and I agree with everyone. And the tipping point in the Freudian slip happened with Milosevic himself, and it showed a lot of 20th century fascism illustrated in just one sentence, when he said in Gazimestan, ako ne znamo da radimo, znamo da se borimo. If we don't know how to work, we know how to fight. And that inaugurated a political movement that said, I'm not actually going to engage in transformation. I'm not going to engage in democracy. I'm not going to engage in institutional building of functioning democracies. I'm not going to engage into putting my country into the European Union. I'm going to engage in the lowest common denominator of humankind, and that's hatred. And that's producing hatred against others and mobilizing people on that path. So yes, Milosevic used Kosovo. Yes, he blocked the Yugoslav Federation. Yes, he legally challenged the functionality of the Yugoslav constitution with his own constitution. And by initiating the wars, he basically not destroyed the country because it was up there for grabs, but he destroyed it in a violent way.
Thanks. Vladimir, quickly, or you will keep for the next one?
Well, this is, of course, an inspiring question, especially Milosevic is an inspiring topic. But what I think is key to understand is how the Serbian and primarily Belgrade public succumbed to Milosevic. And this is strange, or this is an interesting, I live there, so it's an interesting development, because if you think about Milosevic's politics, this is like doing something without an exit strategy, because there was no obvious strategy to the whole thing. Now, when it comes to Kosovo, there was. That's one thing where the aim and the means were clear, and they were used, and Veton has described them several times. But outside of that, you go to Croatia, and then what? And you make siege to Dubrovnik, and then what? And you bomb Sarajevo, and then what? So you have a policy which is completely without exit strategy. You don't know why are you doing that? What is exactly, what do you want to do? And this is easy to understand as Milosevic's strategy, because that's a means of him getting on top of things, being in charge. But the fact that the Serbian political public and Serbian people, if you wish, were ready to follow that, and it cannot still get out of this, I think that is the key issue to me, in any case. That is what made this whole problem of Yugoslavia unsolvable, and the whole country had possibly no other choice but to go where it went. But that's Milosevic himself as a person and as ambition, that is trivial. That's obvious. We know why he did it. We know what he wanted. He achieved that to a very large extent. As politics of Serbian leadership, of Serbian public, of Serbian intellectuals, and so on, this is very difficult to understand, because this is a policy without obvious end and without exit strategy. You start banging around, and then what? And that is where we are now, 30 years later. Some have got out, Slovenia, Croatia, Montenegro, Macedonia to an extent, but the rest is still there because of this basically inability to change political course in Serbia. It was not given that, I have to disagree a little bit with Veton, it was not given that there was no possibility of understanding with Kosovo. I personally spoke to Ibrahim Rugova at the very beginning. The problem was that the Democratic Party, which I started, Paragada parties and was not ready to talk to Kosovo, emerging Kosovo democratic leadership. That is the whole problem. It is not that we could not have found modus vivendi and a strategy of living together this way or that way. But it was not in the cards given the policy that Serbian policy that I described.
Okay, thanks.
Okay,
thanks. Sorry to interrupt you, but we have to go, let's say, further. So I'll go with just one last question, and then we'll have to stop. We can't go forever. I think this is a very provocative question. So do you think that the 1974 constitution, which increased the autonomy of the republics, was the first step towards the dissolution of Yugoslavia, because it led to strengthening of secessionist movements and perhaps also to nationalists? So who wants to take this one?
Well, I hate to talk all the time, but the major disappointment of the constitution was in Serbia. So you could say that was a trigger point. Serbia was never really accepted the 1974 constitution. So that's, if you would wish to think about it, that as a cause of something, that would be, from then onwards, you have the demand in Serbia for constitutional reform, which then ended with all these constitutional problems that you had at the end of the 80s.
I think what should have happened, I think this Constitution of '74 was an enormous step in democracy and decision-making in Yugoslavia, in subsidiarity, if you will, in European terms. What should have happened, of course, is post-'74 that it should have been accompanied by internal democratization within the republics. And had there been a movement towards democracy, towards a multi-party system, towards rule of law, whatever we were asking in the 80s, if that had happened, we never know what the outcome would have been. But what most of us believed at the time and worked at the time and spoke about was that whatever happened, it should not have been bloody. If you had democratically legitimized elites trying to work out an arrangement, maybe an arrangement would have been found. And an arrangement can mean also a dissolution in peace. What happened was that the '74 Constitution, and an illustration of this and of what Vlado was saying, is that the elites in Serbia were confronted with this issue, and intellectuals and people who were on the opposition side for many years were confronted with the dilemma whether they should be engaging on the debate on changing the constitution of Serbia towards a more centralized republic or a more democratic republic. And those who had been working for many years for a multi-party system suddenly decided that it was much more important to integrate Kosovo and Vojvodina by force into the Serbian constitution and not allowing every Serb citizen to vote for its own government.
May I say a few words on this?
Yes.
First of all, the '74 Constitution and further decentralization, let's say, that it brought with it was continuity rather than an exception. I mean, Yugoslavia dealt with a lot of its problems before that by decentralizing. That was a big Kardev thing, actually, was, whenever in doubt, decentralize. And I don't think that was the cause of breakup or contributed to the breakup. The problem was that it actually couldn't be implemented. It was only invoked when the country was basically already gone and fallen apart. But the people who thought of it were the people who were the leadership of the former Yugoslav republics in the late 60s and early 70s. It was their ideas. And they were then forced out of power. And it was sort of let's say, a kind of giving in a little bit to the ideas that were promoted by people who were actually forced out of power or dismissed. This whole generation of politicians across Yugoslavia who actually were looking for a different source of legitimacy because they were too young to be part of the Second World War and the partisan movement mostly. And their ideas were implemented through the 74 constitution, but they were not around anymore to implement it and to lead this possible or lead this as a possible basis for gradual democratization of the country. So it was stuck as a contentious point of nationalist mobilization rather than as a tool for democracy or democratization, which it could have been, I think.
Thanks. Momir, do you want to, or?
It's not really that I can have something very, I mean, it's difficult for me to say that would be the beginning of, the end. I think the democratization at that time, at least what I remember from Slovenia, of course, being, very young at that time, that was that reform, that constitutional change was considered as a positive way, in a way towards the, more democratization, but it obviously was not really able to be implemented the way it was expected. It was going too far.
Okay, thanks. So I think we'll have to stop here because we are already 14 minutes above our time. So thanks first to the panelists for the excellent discussions today. Then thanks also for everybody else, for the attendees, for your patience, and sorry that you couldn't answer all your questions. We'll try to be more efficient next time. The event will be published online on our YouTube channel. So if you want to see whatever from it, feel free to visit it in the next few days. And visit our website, follow our website for our next events. And looking forward to see you on some other occasion. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.